I maintain that view even when many thought that that particular president would be Hillary Clinton. But now the election season is over, and we have a new president who has nominated a superbly qualified candidate to fill that 9th seat. So I would invite Democrats who spent many months insisting we need 9 to join us in following through on that advice by giving the new president's nominee fair consideration and an up or down vote, just as we did for past presidents of both parties.
Early afternoon.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
No, we are not.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has leave to meet after 2 p.m. today.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, that's okay. Whatever. It's leftover remarks from yesterday. Madam President, I rise today on a matter of great importance to everyone in this body and everyone in America: the future of the Supreme Court. Last night, the President nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch. We in the Senate have a constitutional duty to examine his record robustly, exhaustively, and comprehensively, and then advise and consent if we see fit. We have a responsibility to reject if we do not. We Democrats will insist on a rigorous but fair process. There will be 60 votes for confirmation. Any one member can require it. Many Democrats already have. And it is the right thing to do. On a subject as important as the Supreme Court nomination, bipartisan support should be a prerequisite. It should be essential. That's what 60 votes does. This is nothing new. It was a bar met by each of President Obama's nominations. In my mind, 60 votes is the appropriate way to go, whether there is a Democratic president or Republican president, Democratic Senate or Republican Senate. Mr. President, Madam President, because a 60-vote threshold is essential, those who say at the end of this process there are only 2 possible results, that the Senate will confirm this nominee or the Republicans will use the nuclear option to change the rules of the Senate, are dead wrong. That is a false choice. If this nominee cannot meet the same standard that Republicans insisted upon for President Obama's Supreme Court nominees, 60 votes in the Senate, then the problem lies not with the Senate, but with the nominee. The answer should not be to change the rules of the Senate, but to change the nominee to someone who can earn 60 votes. 60 votes produces a mainstream candidate. And the need for a mainstream consensus candidate now is greater now than ever before, because we are in new territory in 2 ways. First, because the court under Chief Justice Roberts has shown increasing drift to become a more and more pro-business, pro-special interest court, siding more with corporations and employers and special interests over working and average Americans. This in an environment where starkly unequal concentrations of wealth and ever-increasing corporate power, aided and abetted by the Citizens United decision, has skewed the playing field even more decisively towards special interests and away from the American citizen. A mainstream nominee would help reverse that trend, not exacerbate it. And second, another important reason that we're in a new world here, and making a 60-vote margin even more important than it was before, as important as it was before. And that is this. This administration, at least at its outset, seems to have less respect for the rule of law than any in recent memory, and is challenging the Constitution in unprecedented fashion. So there's a special burden on this nominee to be an independent jurist. Let's go over each point. First, we have a special responsibility to judge whether or not this nominee will further tip the scales on the court in favor of big business and powerful special interests instead of the average American. Because over 2 decades, this court has shifted dangerously in the direction of big business and powerful special interests. According to a study by the Minnesota Law Review, the Roberts Court has been the most business-friendly Supreme Court since World War II. It is the most corporate court in over 70 years. It was pro-corporate when it frequently favored forced arbitration as a way to settle disputes, a process that limits the ability for individuals to form a class and collectively go after large corporate interests. It was pro-corporate when it repeatedly refused to hear legitimate cases where individuals have been harmed by faulty products, discriminatory practices, or fraud. And it was pro-corporate when it came down with one of the worst decisions in the history of the court, Citizens United. By equating money with speech, the Citizens United decision cut right at the heart of the most sacred power in our democracy, the franchise of our citizens. It has poisoned our politics by allowing dark money to cascade into the system entirely undisclosed. With absolutely no precedent, the Roberts Court came up with the theory that money necessarily equals speech, and under the First Amendment, you're allowed to put your ad on TV 11,000 times to drown out all others, especially average Americans. That dampens the power of their voices, dilutes the power of their votes. The Citizens United decision was the worst decision in 100 years, and it is the embodiment of this new era of the corporate special interest court. At a time when massive inequality plagues our economy, dark money floods our politics, and faith in institutions is low, this rightward shift in the court is an existential threat to our democracy. Now more than ever, we require a justice who will move the court back in the direction of the people, not only because that's what the law requires, but because that's what our system of government requires, summed up, of course, by President Lincoln's declaration that it is a government of, by, and for the people. And second, Madam President, we must insist upon a strong mainstream consensus candidate because this Supreme Court will be tried in ways that few courts have been tested since the earliest days of the Republic, when constitutional questions abounded. Because again, this administration seems to have little regard for the rule of law and is likely to test the Constitution in ways it hasn't been challenged for decades. Just 2 weeks in, the new administration has violated our core values, challenged the separation of powers, stretched the bounds of statute, and tested the very fabric of our Constitution in an unprecedented fashion. The President has questioned the integrity of our elections without evidence, issued legally and constitutionally dubious executive actions, such as the one on immigration and refugees, and fired his acting Attorney General for maintaining her fidelity to the law rather than pledging obedience to the President. For that, the White House accused her of betrayal. Acting Attorney General Sally Yates offered her professional legal opinion, but because it contradicted the administration's position, she was fired, even though the very purpose of the Department of Justice is to be an independent check on any administration. We are just 13 days into this new administration. How many more of these dismissals will take place over the next 4 years? This is not even close to normal. Many of us have lived through the first few weeks of several administrations of both parties. This is not even close to normal. So now more than ever, we need a Supreme Court justice who is independent, who eschews ideology, who will preserve our democracy, protect fundamental rights, and will stand up to a president who has already shown a willingness to bend the Constitution. The Supreme Court is now the bulwark, standing between a president who in too many instances has little regard for the law, for the separation of powers, for American ideals, and for the power of the legislative branch and the sanctity of the nation. Now more than ever, we require a justice who will fulfill the Supreme Court's role in our democracy as a check and balance on the other branches of government. Madam President, because this president has started out in such a fundamentally undemocratic way, we have to examine this nominee closely. As to the nominee himself, I have serious concerns about how he measures up on these two great issues I just described. First, Judge Gorsuch has consistently favored corporate interests over the rights of working people. He repeatedly sided with insurance companies who wanted to deny disability benefits to employees. In employment discrimination cases, Bloomberg found he has sided with employers the great majority of the time. In one of the few cases he sided with an employee, it was a Republican woman who alleged she was fired for being a conservative. He wrote in an article in 2005 that securities class actions were just tools for plaintiff lawyers to get, quote, free rides to fast riches, ignoring the fact that these lawsuits often bring to justice thousands and thousands of people who have no power without the class action suit. And on money and politics, he seems to be in the same company as Justices Thomas and Scalia, willing to restrict the most common sense contribution limits. It seems that President Trump, who has said he would be for the working man and woman, has not chosen someone who routinely sides with the average American. Instead, it seems he has selected a nominee to the Supreme Court who sides with CEOs over citizens. And second, Judge Gorsuch lacks a record of demonstrating the kind of independence the court desperately needs right now. He has shown a tendency to let ideology influence his decisions, criticizing liberals for turning the courts to advance policy. The irony is this: those who blame liberals for legislating through the courts are usually activist judges themselves. In recent years, conservative judges have proven to be the true activists, completely reimagining the scope of the First Amendment through Citizens United, gutting a key provision of the Voting Rights Act that had lasted for decades and decades, and attempting to roll back the established law of the land, Roe v. Wade. Mr. Gorsuch, Judge Gorsuch, has shown disdain for the use of the courtroom to vindicate fundamental rights, a viewpoint that should be anathema to anyone in the legal system, but is particularly inappropriate for somebody who seeks a seat on the highest court of the land. Because of this, women are duly worried about the preservation of their rights and equality, as is the LGBT community. With an administration that has already challenged fundamental American rights and will do so again, the courtroom must be a place where those rights can be vindicated. As senators, we are endowed with an awesome power to judge whether this man, Judge Gorsuch, has the right to a title that is higher than all the others in our judicial system, the title of justice. Therefore, we must be absolutely certain that this person is a strong, mainstream candidate who has respect for rule of law and the application of basic constitutional rights to all Americans, a deference to precedent, a non-ideological approach to the court, and the resolve to be a bulwark against the constitutional encroaches of this administration. Judge Neil Gorsuch, throughout his career, has repeatedly sided with corporations over working people, demonstrated a hostility to women's rights, and most troubling, yielded to an ideological approach to jurisprudence that makes me skeptical that he can be a strong and independent justice on the court. Given that record, I have very serious doubts that Judge Neil Gorsuch is up to the job. Mr. President, Madam President, the Supreme Court now rests in delicate balance. We cannot allow it to be further captured by corporate influence or bullied by executive overreach. The Senate has a responsibility to weigh this nominee with the highest level of scrutiny, to have an exhaustive, robust, and comprehensive debate on Judge Gorsuch's fitness to be a Supreme Court justice. We Democrats will ensure that it does. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Democratic Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the request in relation to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence be vitiated.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from Iowa.
last evening I had the pleasure of being at the White House when President Trump introduced his nominee to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Neil Gorsuch, who happens to be serving on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that President Trump delivered on a promise made during the campaign when he listed 21 people that he would choose from. Everybody knew ahead of time what sort of a judge he would put on for this vacancy or any future vacancy. Judge Gorsuch's decade of service on the 10th Circuit has earned him a reputation as a brilliant, principled, and mainstream judge. Just exactly the sort of mainstream that Senator Schumer just must have been thinking about when he said he wants a mainstream judge. It's already been widely reported that he was unanimously confirmed by a voice vote to the 10th Circuit in 2006. There are still 31 senators in this body who voted for the judge at that particular time. 11 of them are Democrats, and one of them is Senator Schumer. Judge Gorsuch was, of course, supported by both of his home state senators for the 10th Circuit. One happened to be a Republican, one a Democrat. He has been recognized as a great jurist by members from both parties. For instance, when he was sworn in to the 10th Circuit, Senator Salazar, then Democrat senator from Colorado, remarked that the judge, quote, has a sense of fairness and impartiality that is a keystone of being a judge, end of quote. The judge happens to be a fourth-generation Colorado. He is eminently qualified to be the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. His decades of experience spanned many facets of our legal system. A graduate of Columbia University and Harvard Law School, the judge was also a prestigious Marshall Scholar at Oxford. He served as Principal Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Judge Gorsuch also knows the Supreme Court well, having clerked for Supreme Court Justices Byron White and also Anthony Kennedy, who's still on that court. He currently serves with distinction on the 10th Circuit, where he has established himself as mainstream judge with a reputation as a fair and brilliant jurist. As a mainstream jurist, Judge Gorsuch enjoys broad respect across the ideological spectrum. All the confirmation hearings for his current confirmation hearings for his current judgeship on the 10th Circuit, he was introduced by a Republican Senator Allard from Colorado, a Democrat Senator Salazar from Colorado. Senator Salazar, of course, isn't exactly a conservative firebrand, having most recently served as head of the transition team of Secretary Clinton. At his hearing in 2006, William Hughes, Jr., a Democratic candidate for the House of Representatives, authored a strong letter of recommendation for Judge Gorsuch, stating, quote, "I have never found nor thought Neil's views or opinions to be tainted or swayed by any partisan leanings. Quite to the contrary, his approach to all things professional and personal has always been moderate and practical." End of quote of Mr. Hughes's letter. And there are plenty of other examples of strong bipartisan support for Judge Gorsuch. Even observers in the press recognize his reputation for fairness. Just last week, the Denver Post endorsed the judge, saying he, quote, "has applied the law fairly and consistently," end of quote. Judge John Kane, a colleague on the District Court of Colorado, appointed by President Carter, says that Judge Gorsuch, quote, "listens well and decides justly. His dissents are instructive rather than vitriolic. In sum, I think he is an excellent judicial craftsman," end of quote. After his nomination was announced last evening, the highest praise so far came from President Obama's former Solicitor General Neil Katyal, who described the nominee this way, quote, "Judge Gorsuch is one of the most thoughtful and brilliant judges to have served our nation over the last century. As a judge, he has always put aside his personal views to serve the rule of law. To boot, as those of us who have worked with him can attest, he is a wonderful, decent, and humane person. I strongly support his nomination for the Supreme Court," end of quote of President Obama's former Solicitor General Neil Katyal. To me, following the law, wherever that law and case may lead, is perhaps the most important attribute for a Supreme Court justice to possess. That principle guided Justice Scalia's decision-making, and it's also how Judge Gorsuch has said judges should approach the law. As the judge once wrote, quoting Justice Scalia, quote, "If you're going to be a good and faithful judge, you have to resign yourself to the facts that you're not always going to like the conclusion you reach. If you like them all the time, you're probably doing something wrong," end of quote. That gets back to something very basic. A judge is supposed to be dispassionate. A judge is supposed to leave their personal views out of it. A judge looks at the law on the one hand and the facts of the case on the other and make your decision just based on those two things. So what I have learned so far, the judge's judicial record reflects this philosophy of being dispassionate, following the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress. I think he said last night something like, judge is supposed to judge and a legislature is supposed to legislate, and a judge should not be legislating. Judge Gorsuch doesn't legislate from the bench, nor does he impose his own beliefs on others. I want to quote from a speech at Case Western that the judge said, "Judges should strive," quote, "to apply the law as it is, focusing backwards, not forward, and looking to the text, to the structure, and to history to decide what a reasonable reader at the time of the events in question would have understood the law to be. Not to decide cases based on their own moral convictions or the policy consequences they believe might serve society best," end of quote. I believe it is this fundamental sense of fairness, sense of duty in upholding the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress that has led the judge to be a highly regarded jurist. After the tragic passing of Justice Scalia, we made it clear that the Senate would wait for the American people to have a say in the future of the court. I said, even before the election, that no matter who won the presidential election, we would move forward with a new president's nominee. I maintained this position even on the eve of the election, and I maintained that position even when everyone seemed to believe that our next president would be Secretary Clinton. I've been consistent. Unfortunately, some of my Democrat colleagues, the very senators who held all those rallies chanting, "We need 9, have already said they intend to do everything they can to stop this eminently qualified judge. That is very, very unfortunate. I hope and trust that approach won't be uniform on their side. So I look forward to moving forward with a hearing when we will learn a great deal more about Judge Gorsuch, and I look forward to an up or down vote on his nomination. I thank the Senate. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
The Majority Whip.
Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, finally, on Monday, the Senate moved forward with the nomination of Rex Tillerson to be the next Secretary of State. His confirmation before this chamber to serve as our top diplomat should have been a no-brainer. But we know that our Democratic colleagues are still trying to relitigate the election of November the 8th, and because their preferred candidate lost, they're now trying to do everything they can to slow walk and to hamper the ability of the winner, President Trump, to get his cabinet up and running to govern the country. And while they think they may be hurting the president and his administration, what they're really doing is hurting the American people who the government serves. And I hope they would reconsider. It's really sad it's taken this long due to the foot dragging of our colleagues across the aisle who are sort of in a resistance mode. I really do believe it's like the stages of grief. I think they're the Kubler-Ross stages, where the first one, of course, is denial, the second is anger, and then ultimately you get to acceptance. But they're a long way to acceptance, and they're still in the anger phase of their grieving of the outcome of the November the 8th election. When the shoe was on the other foot, we confirmed 7 of President Obama's cabinet nominees on the day he was inaugurated, January the 20th, 2009. But apparently this is the new normal, and I just hope our Democratic colleagues realize that this is not serving the public interest. And it's not, frankly, good politics, it doesn't strike me, just to be so angry and throw a temper tantrum, or as I said yesterday to some folks, I said it really, growing up, people used to talk about throwing a hissy fit, and this really strikes me as throwing a hissy fit. Well, just on Mr. Tillerson, before I move on, much has been made of his incredible leadership role in a major global corporation, and obviously he's done a tremendous job for one of the largest businesses in the world. But he was working for the shareholders of that corporation in that capacity. Now, his enormous experience and aptitude and talent are going to be put to work for the American nation and for the American people. And I believe that not only is he a person of conviction and competence, he's also a man of character. He believes in putting this country first, and I have no doubt that he will serve the United States with great integrity and care. And it's none too early for us to transition to somebody of his great qualifications and experience. Our country's no longer respected by many of our friends around the world because we have withdrawn from international leadership. We are no longer feared by our adversaries, who are all too quick to fill the leadership vacuum around the world. Russia being perhaps the most obvious example, not only in Crimea and Ukraine, but obviously in Syria and now in Libya. And it's dangerous. It's destabilizing. So I'm really pleased that we'll have a new Secretary of State and a new national security leadership team. If there's one thing that I think President Trump has done right, it's select good people. From Mike Pence as the Vice President, General Jim Mattis as Secretary of Defense, Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, General John Kelly at the Department of Homeland Security. I think he has chosen very well, and I could go on and on with his cabinet members and say the same thing about each one of them. Well, we'll vote on that confirmation of Mr. Tillerson shortly, between 2 and 2:30 in that time frame. But really what I wanted to talk about as well is the announcement that President Trump made last night about his choice to fill the Supreme Court vacancy left open by the tragic death of Justice Antonin Scalia. I couldn't be more pleased with his nomination of Judge Neil Gorsuch of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. I can't imagine the president could have chosen a more qualified, more principled, or more mainstream pick for the job of Justice of the United States Supreme Court. We've all heard some of the details about his personal background, but he's a Colorado native. He served in the Denver-based 10th Circuit Court for a decade, and he is well known and respected in legal circles for his intellect, his brilliant writing, and his faithful interpretation of the Constitution and laws passed by Congress. In short, he's a tremendous jurist with an impeccable legal and academic record. He went to schools like Columbia University, Harvard Law School, Oxford, as a Marshall Scholar. In addition to his decade on the bench, his professional experience includes many years practicing law. And as a recovering lawyer myself and recovering judge, I can say one of the things I think the Supreme Court needs is more people with practical experience serving as lawyers for clients in court. We've got some people with great academic credentials, but very few people with any practical experience as practicing lawyers. And it's important because justices, once they get on the United States Supreme Court, they are totally isolated from the rest of the world by the nature of their job. So people need to come to that job with the experience of working with individuals, understanding the strengths and the weaknesses of the legal system and what their role should be. So he not only practiced law at a top law firm as a partner there, he had prestigious clerkships, including on the Supreme Court of the United States. He actually clerked for 2 Supreme Court justices, Justice Byron White and Justice Anthony Kennedy, as well as served in the Department of Justice. There is absolutely no question that Judge Gorsuch is a qualified, high-caliber nominee, and I have no doubt that he will serve the nation well. The reason why I say he's a qualified, high-caliber nominee, when he was confirmed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, he was confirmed by the Senate on a voice vote. In other words, he was essentially voted unanimously, including people like Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader, who was here at the time, and others of our colleagues across the aisle. So I think it's going to be really important for the American people, as they hear the inevitable criticism of this nomination, that they remember the senators who were here at the time Judge Gorsuch was confirmed to the 10th Circuit, and they expressed none of those concerns or reservations. I think most importantly, Judge Gorsuch will honor the legacy of Justice Antonin Scalia on the United States Supreme Court. But even more importantly, he'll honor the United States Constitution and the unique role of our judiciary in our system of government. You know, I think one of the things that Justice Scalia made a point of during his professional lifetime is to point out how judges had unfortunately become policymakers rather than interpreters and appliers of the Constitution and written laws. And of course, the problem with that is that judges in the federal system don't stand for election. So you have lifetime tenured, unelected federal judges becoming in effect a trump card or super legislature for our system of government. That certainly isn't what James Madison and the Founding Fathers contemplated. And Justice Scalia was a tribute to that traditional role of an interpreter of a written Constitution and written laws, and respecting the limited, albeit important, role that judges play in our system of government. So put another way, Judge Gorsuch meets every test, and he passes all of them with flying colors. Well, we've heard from the Democratic leader that President Trump needed to appoint a mainstream nominee. Well, there is no doubt that if that's the litmus test for our friends on the other side of the aisle, that Judge Gorsuch meets that test. He has the respect of even people who serve on the other side of him in litigation and people whose ideological views differ quite a bit. Here's what a former Solicitor General under President Obama had to say about Judge Gorsuch. He said, quote, "Judge Gorsuch is one of the most thoughtful and brilliant judges to have served our nation over the last century. As a judge, he has always put aside his personal views to serve the rule of law." He goes on to say, "I strongly support his nomination to the Supreme Court." This is the sort of respect that Judge Gorsuch and his tenure as a judge has generated, even from people who are on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum, because they realize that Judge Gorsuch will be first and foremost somebody that applies the written Constitution and enforces the rule of law, laws passed by the political branches of government, and does not attempt to supplant his own personal agenda for that of the chosen representatives of the American people. As I said, that's why 11 years ago, Democrats joined with Republicans to confirm him unanimously to the 10th Circuit. I mentioned Senator Schumer was here at the time, Senator Durbin, several members of the Judiciary Committee still serving in the Senate, including the ranking member, Senator Feinstein from California, and the senior senator from Vermont, Senator Leahy. All of them were here, and because of the voice vote, they didn't note any dissent or disagreement. We would say that that essentially is a unanimous vote of the United States Senate. So it'll be interesting to hear from them about any reservations or concerns they now voice. I hope at least they will allow us to have an up or down vote on the nomination of this outstanding nominee. To hear Judge Gorsuch last night and to look at his biography, to read his extensive record and appreciate his scholarship and his commitment to the rule of law, all of this is to see precisely the kind of person who should be confirmed to the Supreme Court. I believe the American people will see that as clear as day. So I hope our colleagues across the aisle will resist the temptation to obstruct and drag their feet when it comes to this important nomination. I hope they won't kowtow to some of the extreme factions in their own party. They've repeatedly argued for the importance of having 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And now that the American people have spoken, electing President Trump, and he's now announced his pick, they should honor that selection. And that pick is superb, the kind of nominee who is supported unanimously by Democrats in the past and is endorsed by President Obama's own Solicitor General. So let's move forward with an undeniably qualified nominee. Madam President. Madam President, I would ask that all unanimous consent that all remaining quorum calls on the Tillerson nomination be equally divided.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.